That was the word Judge Arthur Hayes lived by. The controlled hush of his courtroom in the Dirksen Federal Building, the controlled rhythm of the law as it ground forward, the controlled, impenetrable fortress he had built around his own heart. For 25 years, that fortress had held. Today, it was about to be breached. All rise, the bailiff's voice boomed, the sound cutting through the sterile air-conditioned silence. Arthur adjusted the black robes on his shoulders, the familiar weight a comfort, a shield. He scanned the room with a practiced, dispassionate gaze. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, the empty jury box waiting to be filled. It was just another Tuesday. Another docket of lives to be measured and weighed. Calling the next case on the docket, the bailiff continued, his voice devoid of emotion. The State of Illinois versus Maya Washington. Case number 24, CR 791. Charges are armed robbery and aggravated battery. The name hit Arthur like a physical blow. Maya Washington. It wasn't a common name, not in his world. Not anymore. For a dizzying second, the polished oak of the bench felt like shifting sand beneath his palms. His breath caught in his throat. It couldn't be. The odds were astronomical. A ghost from a different life, a different world, summoned here? In his courtroom. He gripped the gavel, his knuckles white. Control. He forced his gaze toward the side door where the defendants entered. He told himself it was a coincidence. A different Maya. But then the door opened, and she walked in, flanked by two marshals. The clink of her leg shackles was the only sound in the suddenly suffocating room. It was her. The years had carved new lines onto her face, lines of worry and exhaustion that hadn't been there when she was a girl with laughter in her eyes and scraped knees. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and the vibrant life that had once radiated from her was now a low, guarded ember. She wore the drab-orange jumpsuit of the Cook County Jail, a uniform designed to strip a person of their identity. But it couldn't strip away her eyes. Those same deep, intelligent, defiant eyes that knew his oldest, darkest secret. His mind fractured. The courtroom dissolved, replaced by a flash of memory so vivid it smelled of summer rain on hot Chicago asphalt. He saw two kids, a boy with neatly parted hair and a girl with braids flying behind her, racing their bikes down a cracked sidewalk on the south side. He could hear their shared laughter, feel the sticky heat of a shared popsicle, and the cold dread of a whispered pact made in the terrifying darkness after the sound of shattering glass and a single piercing scream. The ghost of another boy, Leo, flickered at the edge of his vision. Your Honor? The prosecutor's voice snapped him back to the present. Mark Vincent, a sharp, ambitious attorney, was looking at him with a hint of concern. Arthur realized the entire room was waiting. He had been silent for too long. Proceed, Mr. Vincent, Arthur said, his voice a low rasp. He cleared his throat, forcing the sound to become the firm, commanding tone of Judge Hayes, not the terrified voice of a boy named Artie. He had to recuse himself. It was the first, roaring thought in his head. The law was clear. Any personal connection, no matter how tenuous or distant, was grounds for recusal. It was an open and shut case of judicial ethics. His career, his reputation, everything he had meticulously built, depended on it. He would let another judge handle this. He would walk away, wash his hands of it, and pretend that Ghost had never walked through his door. But then Maya looked up. Her gaze swept past the prosecutor, past the young public defender assigned to her, and settled on him. There was no shock in her eyes. No plea for help. There was only a profound, heartbreaking recognition. It was a look that said, so, it comes to this. After all this time, this is where we end up. She knew who he was. And in that silent, damning stare, she wasn't just a defendant. She was a co-conspirator. The only other living person who knew the truth of what they did that summer. The truth that his powerful father had buried under layers of money, threats, and lies. The truth that had allowed him to ascend to this bench while her life had clearly taken a very different path. The charges were read aloud. Robbery of a high-end convenience store in Lincoln Park. A clerk pistol-whipped. The getaway car, registered to her, found abandoned 2 blocks away. The evidence, as presented by Vincent, seemed damning. A woman in financial distress, a desperate act. A simple, tragic story. Arthur knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it wasn't simple at all. Maya was a fighter, a survivor. She wasn't a thief. And she would never, ever be that careless. If she was here, it wasn't by accident. She was put here. Recusing himself now wouldn't be upholding the law. It would be running away. Again. Just like he did 25 years ago when his father had told him to never speak her name again. He had let her face the fallout of their shared secret alone. He would not do it again. The young public defender, a woman named Sarah Jenkins who looked barely out of law school, stood beside Maya. "How does your client plead, Ms. Jenkins?" Arthur asked, his voice now unervingly steady. The decision had been made. The fortress wall was cracking, and he was stepping through the breach. Sarah Jenkins whispered to her client. Maya shook her head slightly, then straightened her shoulders. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the voice of a victim. It was clear, strong, and carried across the silent courtroom, aimed directly at him. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Arthur met her gaze. The room, the law, the years between them, it all fell away. They were just two people, bound by a terrible secret, standing on opposite sides of a chasm called justice. He was the judge. She was the accused. And somewhere in the shadows, he knew the real monster was watching, pulling the strings of this vicious play. He brought the gavel down, the sharp crack sealing his fate as much as hers. "The defendant will be remanded into custody. We will set a date for the preliminary hearing." As the marshals led her away, Maya didn't look back. She didn't have to. The message had been delivered. Arthur sat on his bench, the black robe suddenly feeling less like a shield and more like a shroud. He had just made the most reckless, unethical, and dangerous decision of his life. This wasn't a case. It was a reckoning. And it had just begun. The heavy oak door of his chambers clicked shut, the sound echoing the finality of a cell door closing. Arthur tore at the collar of his shirt, the starched fabric suddenly constricting his breath. The black robe lay discarded on a leather armchair, a collapsed shadow of the authority it represented. He paced the length of the Persian rug, the Chicago skyline staring impassively through his floor-to-ceiling window, a panorama of steel and glass that felt more like a cage than a kingdom. Recuse. The word hammered in his skull. It was the only sane, logical, and legal path. He strode to his desk, his hand hovering over the pristine letterhead, ready to draft the motion that would sever him from Maya Washington's fate. It would be simple. Due to an unforeseen and distant acquaintance with the defendant from decades prior, the court finds it necessary to recuse itself to avoid any appearance of impropriety. Clean. Professional. A lie. As he reached for a pen, his eyes caught a reflection in the polished surface of the desk. Not his own face, but the ghost of a skinny, terrified boy with wide, haunted eyes. The boy who made the vow. The memory wasn't a flash this time. It was a full, crushing immersion. Summer, 1999. The air was thick with the smell of petrichor and industry from the long-dormant steel yards of South Chicago. It was their secret kingdom, a sprawling ruin of rust and concrete where they were kings. Arthur, the cautious planner, Maya, the fearless explorer, and Leo Vance, the dreamer, the one who believed their friendship could conquer the unspoken lines that divided their neighborhood. It was Arthur's idea. The Dare, he'd called it. A tightrope walk across a rusted I-beam 3 stories up. Maya had gone first, nimble and sure-footed. Arthur had followed, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. But Leo hesitated. He was always the most fragile, his spirit brighter than his body was strong. "Come on, Leo. Don't be a chicken," Arthur had taunted, his voice laced with the casual cruelty of a 13-year-old boy trying to prove his own bravery. Prodded by the challenge, Leo stepped onto the beam. He took one step, then another. He wobbled, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. Then his foot slipped on a patch of wet rust. His arms windmilled wildly, his eyes locking with Arthur's in a moment of pure, undiluted terror. And then he fell. The scream was sharp, but the sound that followed was worse. A sickening, wet crunch as his body hit a pile of discarded rebar and concrete below. Silence. They scrambled down, their own screams lodged in their throats. Leo was conscious, but his body was a broken marionette, his leg bent at an impossible angle, his face a mask of agony. It was Arthur's fault. His dare. His stupid, arrogant pride. The next hours were a blur of panic and sirens. But the sharpest memory, the one seared into his soul, was of his father's arrival at the hospital. Jonathan Hayes was not a man who offered comfort, he offered solutions. He was a lion of the Chicago legal world, a man who saw life as a series of chess moves. He took Arthur and Maya into a sterile, windowless waiting room. His voice was not angry, but cold, precise, and utterly terrifying. Arthur, this was an accident. But it will not be perceived that way. A promising boy from a good family, and a boy from the other side of the tracks. They will call you reckless. They will ruin your future. Your scholarships, the Ivy League schools we've talked about, law school, it will all vanish. He turned his gaze to Maya, and the chill in the room deepened. And you, young lady, you will be seen as complicit. They will not be kind to you. Then came the move. The checkmate. I have spoken with the Vance family, Jonathan Hayes said, his tone leaving no room for argument. They have agreed to a settlement. A very generous one. Enough for them to start a new life, somewhere else. Somewhere with better doctors. In return for this generosity, they will attest that Leo was there alone. That he trespassed. That it was a tragic, solitary accident. He looked from his son's terrified face to Maya's stunned silence. This is the only way. For this to work, you two will never speak of this again. To anyone. You will never see each other again. You will walk out of this room and your lives will diverge. This is the price of your future, Arthur. The price is silence. He made them swear it. A vow. Not a promise between friends, but a contract sealed by fear and shame. Arthur had looked at Maya, his eyes begging for forgiveness, but all he saw was a wall of shock and betrayal. He had walked away, following his father, leaving her alone in that cold, white room. The pen slipped from Arthur's numb fingers, clattering onto the desk. He had kept that vow. He had gone to Yale, then Harvard Law. He had clerked for a Supreme Court justice. He had built the perfect life on a foundation of lies, a life paid for by Leo's broken body and Maya's silence. He pushed himself away from the desk and walked back to the discarded robe. He wasn't recusing himself because of a distant acquaintance. He was connected to her by a shared sin. And if she was in this courtroom, it meant their past was no longer buried. Someone had started digging. He picked up the case file, his judicial mind finally cutting through the fog of memory. He read it again, not as a judge, but as the son of the man who taught him how to see the cracks in any story. The arresting officer, a Sergeant Miller, had a history. 2 civil rights complaints filed against him in the last 5 years, both for wrongful arrest based on racial profiling. Both settled out of court. Why would Miller be the one to find Maya, miles from his usual beat? The sole eyewitness, the store clerk. His statement was too perfect, the descriptions too clean, as if recited from a script. And the getaway car. Found abandoned. Too easy. Maya was smarter than that. It felt staged. A trail of breadcrumbs laid out not to evade capture, but to ensure it. The fortress of control was gone. In its place was a cold, clear-eyed certainty. This was a setup. A sophisticated, brutal trap. And Maya was the bait. If he recused himself, she would be handed over to another judge who would see only the surface. A struggling woman, a pile of circumstantial evidence, an overworked public defender. The system would swallow her whole, just as his father had predicted it would all those years ago. The vow of silence had protected him then. Now, it would be her death sentence. He would not run this time. He would stay. He would preside over this trial. He would walk the razor's edge of his own ethics, bending the rules he had sworn to uphold. He would use his position, his knowledge, his power, not to dictate the outcome, but to ensure that every crack in the prosecution's case was pried wide open. He would give her defender, Sarah Jenkins, the weapons she needed to fight. It was a monstrous perversion of his duty. It could destroy him. But the alternative, letting Maya pay the price for his sins a second time, was unthinkable. The vow of silence was broken. A new vow was taking its place. He picked up the phone and dialed his clerk. "Jessica," he said, his voice the calm, measured tone of Judge Arthur Hayes. "Cancel my afternoon appointments. I need to review every single document related to the Illinois versus Washington case. Every preliminary report, every officer's note. I want it all on my desk within the hour." He hung up, the decision settling into his bones not with comfort, but with the grim resolve of a soldier marching into a battle he knew he might not survive. The ghost of the past was no longer a memory. It was a living, breathing entity in his courtroom, and Arthur Hayes was about to go to war. The courtroom was a theater of practiced indifference. A week had passed, a week in which Arthur had slept in snatches, haunted by the specter of his decision. He now sat on the bench, a mask of judicial impartiality cemented on his face, while inside, a storm raged. Mark Vincent, the prosecutor, stood before the jury box, his confidence radiating like heat. He was a storyteller, and today his story was simple, compelling, and damning. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Vincent began, his voice resonating with sincerity, "this is a case about desperation. It's about a woman, Maya Washington, a registered nurse whose license was suspended, a woman drowning in debt, who made a terrible choice." He gestured toward Maya, who sat beside her lawyer, her expression unreadable. "The evidence will show that on the night of October 12th, Ms. Washington entered the Lincoln Park Pantry, a family-owned business, armed with a handgun. It will show that she struck the owner, Mr. Elias Vance, and fled with over $2,000 in cash." The name landed with the force of a physical impact. Vance. He gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white. It had to be a coincidence. Vance was not an uncommon name. Leo's family had vanished, taken his father's money and disappeared into the anonymity of America. They wouldn't still be in Chicago. They couldn't be. He risked a glance at Maya, but her face was a stony mask, revealing nothing. Control. He steadied his breathing, forcing the shock down. It was a distraction. Nothing more. Vincent continued, weaving his narrative. He called his first witness to the stand, Sergeant Miller, the arresting officer. Miller was a burly man with a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl. Vincent led him through the arrest with textbook precision. The bolo, be on the lookout, for the suspect, the discovery of Maya's car, her apprehension nearby. Then, it was Sarah Jenkins's turn. The young public defender approached the witness stand, her demeanor calm but her eyes sharp. Arthur leaned forward slightly, his focus absolute. "Sergeant Miller," Sarah began, her voice clear and steady. "You stated you were on patrol when you spotted Ms. Washington's vehicle. What part of the city were you patrolling?" "District 18. Lincoln Park," Miller grunted. "And your regular assigned district is?" Miller shifted in his seat. "District 7. Englewood." A murmur rippled through the jury box. Englewood was on the south side, a world away from the affluent north side neighborhood of Lincoln Park. "So you were more than 10 miles outside your assigned patrol area, Sergeant?" Sarah pressed. "What brought you to Lincoln Park at 2 in the morning?" "We follow credible tips." "Had intel about potential activity in the area," Miller said, the answer sounding rehearsed. "Intel," Sarah repeated. "But you made no other stops? No other inquiries?" "You just happened to find my client's car, a car that hadn't even been reported stolen, moments after the robbery was called in from a different dispatch channel?" Miller's face flushed. "It was good police work." "Or a good tip," Sarah countered, letting the implication hang in the air before turning to the judge. "No further questions for this witness, Your Honor." Arthur felt a flicker of grim satisfaction. Jenkins was good. Better than he'd hoped. She saw the first crack. Now it was time to see if she could break it open. Vincent's next witness was the victim, the owner of the store. A man in his late 60s, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and a bandage on his temple, introduced himself as Elias Vance. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He studied the man's face, searching for any resemblance to the boy he once knew. There was none. This man was a stranger. It had to be a coincidence. Yet, the name echoed in the silent corners of his mind, a persistent, unnerving hum. Elias Vance recounted the robbery, his voice trembling with manufactured fear. He described a woman in a dark hoodie, her face obscured, who shoved a gun at him and demanded the cash. "Did you get a good look at her face?" Vincent asked. "Not clearly. It was fast. But her height, her build—" "It was her," he said, pointing a shaky finger at Maya. During cross-examination, Sarah Jenkins approached him with an air of sympathy. "Mr. Vance, that must have been a terrifying experience. I'm sorry you had to go through that." "It was," he agreed, his guard visibly lowering. "I was looking over your business records, which the prosecution provided in discovery," Sarah said, her tone conversational. "The Lincoln Park Pantry is part of a larger LLC, correct? Vance Holdings?" "That's right. And I couldn't help but notice an interesting name on the list of your former business partners from many years ago. A man by the name of Jonathan Hayes." The courtroom went silent. Mark Vincent shot to his feet. "Objection. Relevance. Your Honor?" Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. Every eye in the room swiveled from Sarah, to Vincent, to him. This was the moment. The point of no return. His personal connection was now part of the official court record. Any semblance of plausible deniability was gone. He could sustain the objection. Shut it down. It was the safe, correct, ethical thing to do. But it would also bury a truth he was now desperate to unearth. "Overruled," Arthur said, his voice as cold and hard as stone. He looked directly at Vincent. "The defense may be establishing a line of inquiry regarding potential bias. She may proceed. For now." Sarah gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of gratitude. She turned back to the witness. "Mr. Vance, were you or were you not in business with this court's presiding judge's late father?" Elias Vance's composure finally cracked. He licked his lips, his eyes darting nervously toward Arthur. "It was a long time ago. A brief real estate venture. It had nothing to do with this." "Perhaps," Sarah said softly. "It's just quite a coincidence, wouldn't you say?" She let the question linger, a seed of doubt planted firmly in the minds of the jury. The final piece of evidence for the day was the surveillance footage. Vincent presented it with a flourish. While the camera inside the store was, unfortunately, malfunctioning, the exterior street camera captured this. On the screen, a grainy, black-and-white video played. It showed a figure in a hoodie running from the direction of the store and disappearing down an alley. The figure's face was completely obscured. The timestamp in the corner read 1:47 a.m. The 911 call was made at 1:48 a.m., Vincent declared. And Ms. Washington was apprehended at 2:05 a.m., just 3 blocks from that alley. It looked damning. But Arthur saw what others didn't. He had spent his career dissecting evidence, and his eyes caught the flicker. A single, almost invisible digital artifact. A jump in the pixels around the timestamp, a telltale sign of manipulation. The system hadn't mysteriously malfunctioned. The footage hadn't just captured a running figure. It had been edited. This wasn't just a setup. It was a conspiracy. And the conspirators had made a mistake. As he adjourned the court for the day, Arthur's mind was racing. Elias Vance. A business partner of his father. A manipulated video. A cop from the wrong side of town. These weren't cracks in the prosecution's case. They were carefully placed charges, ready to blow the whole thing wide open. And he, the judge, was sitting right on top of the bomb. Sarah Jenkins fought back valiantly, chipping away at the edges of the prosecution's case. She highlighted the inconsistencies in the timeline and the unreliability of the eyewitness identification, but without a solid alternative theory, she was fighting an uphill battle. Arthur, bound by the constraints of his position, could only watch, his frustration mounting. He had to give her more ammunition, but the risk of exposure was immense. The opportunity came during a procedural hearing, with the jury absent. Vincent was arguing to limit the scope of the defense's witness list, calling it a fishing expedition. Your Honor, Vincent argued, his voice sharp with irritation, the defense wishes to call character witnesses who haven't seen the defendant in years. It's irrelevant and designed only to confuse the jury. Arthur saw his opening. Ms. Jenkins, he said, turning to the defense table, his tone carefully neutral. The prosecution raises a valid point about relevance. However, the defendant's state of mind is central to this case. If there are events in her past that could contextualize her actions or provide an alternative explanation for her presence in that neighborhood, the court may be inclined to see their relevance. He let the words hang, a carefully coded message. Look deeper. Look into her past. Sarah's eyes flickered with understanding. She knew the judge was giving her a green light. Later that day, she put Maya on the stand for a voir dire examination, a trial run without the jury present, to determine the admissibility of her testimony. It was a risky move. Vincent's cross-examination was brutal. He cornered Maya with her financial records, her job suspension, her eviction notices. Isn't it true, Ms. Washington, that you were out of options? That you were backed into a corner with nowhere to turn? Maya's composure, so solid until now, began to fray. Her hands, clasped in her lap, were trembling. I was struggling, she admitted, her voice low. But I would never. You would never what? Vincent pressed, moving in for the kill. Hurt someone? Steal? Are you telling this court that you would rather be homeless on the streets than do what was necessary to survive? I would rather go to prison, Maya cried out, her voice cracking with a sudden raw anguish that stunned the room into silence. She looked past Vincent, her gaze finding Arthur on the bench. I would rather go to prison than ever let what happened to Leo happen again. The name hit the air like a gunshot. Vincent froze, momentarily confused. Leo? Who is Leo? Objection! Sarah Jenkins shouted, jumping to her feet to protect her client. The witness is distraught. I request a brief recess. Granted, Arthur snapped, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He slammed the gavel down. Court is in recess for 30 minutes. As the courtroom emptied, Arthur's mind was a whirlwind. What happened to Leo? Maya hadn't said the accident. She had said what happened to him, as if it were an ongoing event. Her words weren't just a slip of the tongue, they were a cry for help. A clue he couldn't ignore. He retreated to his chambers, the pretense of judicial calm shattered. He couldn't use court resources. He couldn't ask the marshals or the FBI. That would leave a paper trail that would lead directly back to him. He needed someone off the books, someone he could trust implicitly, someone who owed him a favor. He thought of David Chen, a former Chicago PD detective who'd left the force under a cloud. Arthur, then a prosecutor, had been the one to uncover the internal corruption that cleared David's name, even though it had made him enemies in the department. David now ran a small private investigation firm. He was discreet, relentless, and he owed Arthur his career. Arthur picked up his personal cell phone, his hands shaking slightly as he dialed. Chen, a gruff voice answered. David, it's Arthur Hayes. A pause. Judge. To what do I owe the honor? I hope you're not calling to tell me my PI license has been revoked. I need you to find someone, Arthur said, cutting to the chase. No questions asked. The name is Leo Vance. He would be about my age, 45. Last known address was in South Chicago, but the family moved away around 1999 after a settlement. The circumstances were complicated. I need to know where he is. I need to know if he's even alive. Vance, David repeated. That's a cold trail, Judge. 25 years. I know. But it's important, Arthur said, his voice tight. Whatever it costs. Consider the favor repaid, David said. I'll start digging. I'll let you know what I find. Arthur hung up, a profound sense of dread mixed with a sliver of hope. He had crossed a definitive line. He was now actively investigating his own case. The trial resumed with a new piece of evidence from the prosecution, the alleged weapon. A small, untraceable .38 caliber revolver. This weapon was recovered from a storm drain less than 100 yards from Ms. Washington's apartment building. Following an anonymous tip, Vincent announced to the jury. Sarah Jenkins was ready. Acting on the subtle permissions Arthur had granted, she had filed a motion for independent forensic analysis. Your Honor, we request that the ballistics from this weapon be compared to the slug recovered from the wall at the crime scene. It was a standard request, one Arthur granted immediately. The state's forensic expert took the stand, and under Sarah's questioning, delivered a bombshell. The rifling patterns do not match, the expert stated plainly. The striations are fundamentally different. The bullet recovered at the Lincoln Park pantry was not fired from this gun. The courtroom buzzed. Vincent's face was a mask of disbelief. The gun, his key piece of physical evidence, was a dud. It had been planted. The anonymous tip was a deliberate misdirection. As the day's proceedings concluded, Arthur felt a grim sense of victory. They had dodged a bullet, literally. But as he packed his briefcase, his personal cell phone vibrated. A text from a blocked number. It was David Chen. The message contained only a single, terrifying line of text. Judge, I found Leo Vance. He never left Chicago. He's been living under the name Leo Croft. You're not going to believe where he works. He's the head of security for Vance Holdings, LLC. The text message burned on Arthur's phone screen, a digital brand searing itself into his consciousness. Head of security for Vance Holdings. He stood in the hushed sanctuary of his chambers, the city lights twinkling below like a galaxy of indifferent stars. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and chaotic, began to slam into place with a horrifying, magnetic force. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a setup by a corrupt cop or a desperate businessman. It was a symphony of revenge, composed and conducted by the ghost they had tried to bury 25 years ago. Leo. Leo was alive. Leo was here. And Leo was pulling the strings. Arthur sank into his leather chair, the room spinning around him. He didn't need David Chen to dig any deeper. He could see it all now, a perfectly constructed play unfolding on his own courtroom stage. The victim, Elias Vance, who was likely a distant relative, a pawn given a name that would resonate with Arthur, a name meant to be the first tremor of the earthquake to come. Or perhaps it wasn't a relative at all, just a man with a price, willing to play a part and adopt a name for the performance. The cop, Sergeant Miller. Leo must have found him, learned of his reputation for profiling, and fed him an anonymous tip. A black woman in a nice neighborhood, looking out of place. It was the perfect bait for a man like Miller, a predictable move in Leo's vengeful chess game. The planted gun. A classic misdirection. Designed to be found, to build a case, and then to be discredited, creating chaos and suspicion, making the prosecution look incompetent and the defense look brilliant. It was a move meant to destabilize the proceedings, to turn the trial into a circus. And the video. The manipulated timestamp. Leo, as head of security, would have had absolute control over the surveillance system. He could have erased, edited, and fabricated anything he wanted. He hadn't created a perfect piece of evidence against Maya. He had created a flawed one. He wanted it to be discovered. He wanted the system to begin to doubt itself, to turn on itself. Arthur's blood ran cold as he realized the sheer, malevolent genius of it all. Leo's target was never just Maya. Her arrest, her public humiliation, that was merely the opening act. The true target was him. Leo had orchestrated this entire affair to force Arthur Hayes, the paragon of judicial integrity, into the ultimate crucible. He had placed Arthur on the bench to judge the very crime they had committed together as children. He wanted Arthur to squirm, to be trapped between his oath to the law and his loyalty to the secret. He wanted to watch Arthur break. What was his endgame? To have Maya wrongfully convicted? No, that was too simple. Leo wasn't just after punishment. He was after something far more refined. He was after a confession, a public immolation. He wanted Arthur to be the one to expose the truth of that summer, to destroy his own life, his own career, in the very temple he had built to his own success. The irony was poetic, and it was cruel. The vow of silence had bought Arthur a life of privilege. For Leo, it had clearly bought a life of pain, a festering wound of resentment that had curdled into this intricate, devastating plot. The settlement money his father had paid hadn't healed Leo, it had insulted him. It had been blood money, meant to purchase his silence and erase his existence. But Leo had refused to be erased. He had lingered in the shadows, watching, waiting, and planning. A wave of nausea washed over Arthur. He was trapped. If he exposed Leo now, he would have to explain how he knew. He would have to confess to using a private investigator, to abusing his position, to being an active participant in the case he was presiding over. He would be disbarred, disgraced, and possibly face criminal charges for obstruction of justice. His life would be over. But if he did nothing, Maya would remain the central pawn in Leo's sick game. She would be collateral damage, her fate hanging in the balance, dependent on the whims of a jury and the skill of a lawyer who didn't know the whole story. He looked at his phone again, the name Leo Croft staring back at him. He couldn't go to the authorities. He couldn't make a sound. But he couldn't let Leo win. There was only one path forward, a path so fraught with peril it made his previous ethical transgressions look like child's play. He had to arm Sarah Jenkins. He couldn't give her the gun, but he could point her to where it was buried. He had to feed her the information, piece by piece, in a way that was untraceable, deniable. He had to turn his courtroom into a proxy war, with Sarah as his unwitting soldier. His hands were steady now, his mind icily clear. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. This was no longer just about protecting Maya or saving himself. This was about confronting the monster they had created. He took out a plain sheet of paper from his desk drawer. He didn't use his own printer. He went to the small, shared office kitchenette, the one used by the clerks and interns, and used the public copier to print a single page. It contained no commentary, no explanation. Just a name and a title. Leo Croft, Head of Security, Vance Holdings, LLC. Later that evening, as he was leaving the courthouse, he saw Sarah Jenkins at the far end of the long, empty marble hallway, packing her worn leather briefcase. She looked exhausted, but determined. Arthur walked in the opposite direction, toward a little-used exit. As he passed a row of public seating, he let the folded piece of paper slip from his hand, letting it flutter to the floor beneath a bench. It was a calculated risk. She might not see it. Someone else might find it. But he had a feeling she would. He was counting on her diligence, her habit of always taking one last look around. He walked out into the cold Chicago night without looking back, the invisible thread between him and his unwitting champion now cast. The next move was hers. Sarah Jenkins found the folded piece of paper. Just as Arthur had gambled, her exhaustion was a catalyst for diligence. Packing her briefcase, she scanned the empty hallway one last time, her lawyer's mind habitually searching for anything out of place. The small white square on the dark marble floor was a magnet for her attention. She picked it up, unfolded it, and read the 5 words. Leo Croft, Head of Security, Vance Holdings, LLC. Her brow furrowed. Leo. The name Maya had cried out on the stand. Croft. An alias. And he worked for the victim's company. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a trail of smoke leading directly into the heart of the fire. The anonymity of the note, its placement, it felt less like an accident and more like a deliberate, anonymous tip. From whom, she couldn't guess. But it changed everything. The next day in court, the atmosphere was electric. Sarah Jenkins carried herself with a new, razor-sharp confidence. She had spent the night connecting the dots, her mind racing. She now had a target. The defense calls its next witness, Sarah announced, her voice ringing with authority. Mr. Leo Croft. A ripple of confusion went through the courtroom. Mark Vincent shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Who is this? This name is not on the witness list the defense provided. Mr. Croft is the head of security for Vance Holdings, the parent company of the business that was robbed, Sarah countered smoothly. His testimony is directly relevant to the mysterious malfunction of the security cameras. We only became aware of his specific role late yesterday. Arthur's heart was a trip hammer against his ribs, but his face remained a stoic mask. Given the relevance to the integrity of the evidence, I'll allow it, he ruled, his voice betraying no emotion. The prosecution will be given ample time for its own discovery and cross-examination. Call your witness, Ms. Jenkins. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and he walked in. Arthur had braced himself, but the sight of Leo still stole the air from his lungs. The years had transformed the fragile boy into a man who moved with a chilling, predatory stillness. He was lean and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. He walked with a slight, almost imperceptible limp, the permanent, physical reminder of the day their world had shattered. His face was handsome, but his eyes, when they met Arthur's, were chips of obsidian, devoid of warmth, filled with an ancient, patient hatred. He took the stand, was sworn in, and faced Sarah Jenkins. The game had begun. "Mr. Croft," Sarah started, her approach deceptively gentle. "You are the head of security for Vance Holdings, correct?" "I am." Leo's voice was smooth, cultured, and utterly calm. "So you would be intimately familiar with the security systems at all their properties, including the Lincoln Park Pantry?" "Of course." "Can you explain to the court how a state-of-the-art system could suffer a complete recording failure on the night of the robbery, yet the exterior street camera, a different system, remained operational?" Leo smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "Technology is fallible, Ms. Jenkins. Redundancies fail. It's unfortunate, but it happens." He delivered the line with perfect composure, a man in complete control. Sarah paced for a moment, then stopped, turning to face him directly. Her tone shifted, losing its gentle edge. "Is Leo Croft your birth name?" Vincent was on his feet again. "Objection." Badgering the witness. "This is completely out of line." Leo, however, simply raised a hand, a gesture of magnanimous calm. "It's quite all right, Your Honor. I have nothing to hide." He looked at Sarah. "No, it is not. My birth name was Leo Vance." The name hung in the air. Arthur saw Maya flinch beside her lawyer, the first crack in her stoic facade. Sarah pressed on, her voice like steel. "Vance. The same last name as the man who owns the store that was robbed, Elias Vance." "Is he a relation?" "A distant cousin," Leo lied, his composure unwavering. "And you grew up in Chicago, Mr. Vance? Or should I say Mr. Croft?" "I did. On the South Side. A rough neighborhood to grow up in," Sarah mused. "Did you have many friends?" "Objection." Vincent thundered. "Where is this going, Your Honor?" This was it. The precipice. Arthur felt the weight of every eye in the room on him. Leo's gaze was a physical force, daring him, challenging him to intervene, to be the protector his father had raised him to be. To choose the lie. Arthur looked down at Maya. Her head was bowed, her shoulders slumped. She looked defeated, as if she expected him to betray her all over again. He would not. He met Leo's cold stare across the courtroom. "Overruled," Arthur said, his voice quiet but absolute, a declaration of war. "The witness will answer the question." A slow, chilling smile spread across Leo's face. It was a smile of triumph. He had won this exchange, regardless of the answer. He had forced the judge's hand. "I had two friends," Leo said, his voice dropping, becoming intimate, confessional, drawing the jury in. "Their names were Artie and Maya." He let the names sink in, then turned his head, just slightly, to lock eyes with Arthur. He leaned toward the microphone, his voice now barely a whisper, but one that every recording device in the room would capture. "Finally," he murmured, the word laced with 25 years of venom. "Finally you choose, Arthur. But who are you choosing?" Leo's whispered words detonated in the courtroom's silence. For a moment, no one moved. The jury looked on in bewilderment, sensing they had just witnessed a critical moment without understanding its meaning. Mark Vincent stood frozen, his mouth agape, the case he had so carefully constructed disintegrating before his eyes. But Sarah Jenkins, empowered by the judge's ruling and her own instincts, saw her opening. She was no longer just a lawyer. She was a hunter who had cornered her prey. "Artie," she repeated, her voice sharp and clear, seizing on the name. "As in Arthur? The same name as the presiding judge in this very courtroom?" "Objection," Vincent roared, finally finding his voice. Your Honor, this has devolved into a personal attack. The defense is creating a circus. I demand a mistrial. Leo simply sat back in the witness chair, a serene, triumphant smile on his face. He had lit the fuse. Now he would enjoy the explosion. All eyes turned to Arthur. This was the end of the line. The carefully constructed walls of his life were crumbling. He could declare a mistrial, as Vincent demanded. It would be a temporary reprieve, a way to stop the bleeding, but it would leave Maya in legal limbo and the truth buried once more. Or he could let it burn. He looked at Maya. Her head was no longer bowed. She was looking at him, her expression not of fear or hope, but of weary expectation. She was waiting to see what he would do with the truth, now that it was in the open. The motion for a mistrial is denied, Arthur said, his voice resonating with a strange, newfound calm. The calm of a man who has already accepted his fate. He turned to Sarah Jenkins. Counselor, you are on a very precarious path. I trust you have a destination in mind. It was all the permission she needed. Mr. Croft, Sarah said, her voice dropping, becoming almost sympathetic. Tell us about this friendship. Tell us what happened to it. And Leo did. The dam of his 25-year silence broke, and a torrent of poisoned memory flooded the courtroom. He didn't shout. He spoke with a chilling, theatrical precision. He told them about the three inseparable friends. He told them about the abandoned steel yard, their secret kingdom. And he told them about the fall. He dared me, Leo said, his eyes locking onto Arthur's. Judge Hayes, the boy who was always so careful, so ambitious, dared me to walk the beam. And like a fool, I did. I fell. I didn't just break my leg, ladies and gentlemen. I shattered it. My growth plate was destroyed. I spent the next 2 years in and out of hospitals for surgeries that never quite fixed me. The jury was spellbound, leaning forward in their seats. But the worst part wasn't the fall, Leo continued, his voice thick with emotion that was both genuine and weaponized. The worst part was the cover-up. His father, the great Jonathan Hayes, swept in. He paid my family to disappear, to pretend it never happened, to say I was there alone. And my friends, my best friends, they made a vow of silence. They let him erase me to protect Artie's precious future. He then turned his attention to the present. He confessed everything, not as a man broken, but as a victor claiming his prize. So, yes, I staged the robbery, he said, a proud, defiant smile on his face. Elias Vance is my uncle. He was drowning in debt. I offered him a way out, a cut of the insurance money in exchange for his participation. I chose the location. I fed the tip to the dirty cop. I planted the useless gun. I doctored the surveillance tapes. And I chose the patsy. He gestured toward Maya. She was perfect. Struggling. Alone. The perfect victim to bring him. He pointed a finger directly at Arthur, to this chair. I didn't want her in prison. I wanted her here. I wanted him here. I wanted the great Judge Arthur Hayes to be forced to look at the wreckage of the lives he built his career on. The courtroom erupted. The bailiffs moved toward the witness stand. Mark Vincent stared, speechless, his case, his career, flashing before his eyes. Leo stood up before the bailiffs could reach him. He looked directly at the jury. She's innocent. I did it all. Then his eyes found Arthur one last time. The game is over, Artie. Checkmate. Chaos ensued. In the aftermath, as bailiffs restrained a triumphant Leo and a stunned Elias Vance, Arthur swiftly gave instructions to the jury. Deliberations were a formality. Within 20 minutes, they returned. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with tears in her eyes, stood and read the verdict. In the case of the state of Illinois versus Maya Washington, on all counts, we the jury find the defendant not guilty. A wave of relief and applause washed through a small section of the courtroom. Maya's shoulders sagged, the tension of weeks, of years, finally releasing. She had her freedom. But she didn't celebrate. As the courtroom cleared, a blur of reporters, lawyers, and stunned spectators, Arthur sat on his bench, the weight of his robes heavier than ever. He had upheld the letter of the law in the most perverse way imaginable. He had allowed a trial to become a public confession, all to achieve a just verdict. His career was over. He knew it. He caught Maya's eye as she was being led out by a jubilant Sarah Jenkins. She stopped. She looked at him, not with gratitude, but with a profound, aching sadness. There was no victory in her eyes. The truth hadn't set them free, it had just illuminated the bars of their shared prison. Without a word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Her silence was his final judgment, more damning than any ruling a judicial committee could ever hand down. Arthur stood, removed his robes for the last time, and laid them carefully over the back of his chair. He walked down from the bench, no longer a judge, just a man. He approached the chief marshal standing by the door. "Frank," he said, his voice steady, "I need you to escort me to the U.S. Attorney's office. I need to make a full confession." 3 months later, the Chicago autumn had bled into the gray prelude of winter. The scandal of Illinois versus Washington had been a firestorm, consuming headlines for weeks before simmering down into the stuff of legal case studies and late-night talk show jokes. Arthur Hayes, once a titan of the federal judiciary, was now just a man waiting for the inevitable. His confession had led to his immediate suspension. A judicial conduct committee was methodically dissecting his career, while the U.S. Attorney's Office weighed charges of obstruction and conspiracy. His life, once a towering monument to order and success, was now a pile of rubble. And yet, in the quiet of his apartment, stripped of his robes and his authority, Arthur felt a strange, unfamiliar peace. The gnawing burden of the secret, the one he had carried for a quarter of a century, was finally gone. He knew he had one last debt to pay, one conversation that couldn't happen in a courtroom or through lawyers. He drove his own car now, an unremarkable sedan, and made his way south, back to the part of the city he had spent his entire adult life trying to escape. He found her at the park. The abandoned steel yard of their childhood had, through a series of urban renewal projects, been transformed. Where rusted rebar and shattered concrete once lay, there were now manicured lawns, a children's playground, and a walking path that traced the edge of the Calumet River. Maya was sitting on a bench overlooking the water, wrapped in a thick coat. She wasn't surprised to see him. It felt as though she had been waiting. He didn't sit beside her, but stood a respectful distance away, the cold wind whipping between them. "I heard you got your nursing license back," he said, his voice quiet. She nodded, not looking at him. A local legal aid clinic helped. Sarah Jenkins put them in touch. They're good people. And Leo? He took a plea deal. So did his uncle. They'll be away for a long time, she said, her voice flat, devoid of triumph. He got what he wanted. Everyone knows the truth now. The silence that followed was heavy with everything left unsaid. The word sorry felt cheap, an insult to the weight of the years she had carried his secret. He had rehearsed speeches in his head, eloquent apologies filled with legal reasoning and emotional regret, but here, in the face of her quiet dignity, they all felt like lies. "I never wanted you to carry it alone," he finally managed, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "After that day in the hospital, my father—" "Your father made a choice to protect you," Maya interrupted, finally turning to look at him. Her eyes were clear, no longer clouded by the trauma of the trial. "And you made a choice to let him. Every day for 25 years, you made that choice, Arthur. You chose the silence. You chose the career. You chose the lie. Every word was true. Every word was a blade twisting in a wound he deserved. The trial," he began, "I stayed on the bench because I thought I could protect you." "You didn't protect me," she said, her voice softening, not with forgiveness, but with a weary clarity. "You protected the secret. You used the law, you used Sarah, you used the whole system to manage a problem. It was never about me, not really. It was always about the secret you and I and Leo were trapped in." She was right. He saw that now. His grand, self-sacrificial gesture was just another layer of control, another calculated move by the son of Jonathan Hayes. "What will you do now?" she asked, her gaze drifting back to the water. "Face the consequences," he said. "Whatever they are. After that, I don't know." Maybe find a way to do some good without a title. Without a bench to hide behind. Maya was quiet for a long time. He could see the playground in the distance, hear the faint laughter of children. A life that could have been. "We can't go back, Arthur," she said finally. "We can't erase what happened here. We can't undo the vow. It's a part of us. A scar." She stood up, pulling her coat tighter around her. They would not be friends. The past was a chasm too wide to cross. The wounds were too deep to be healed by a single conversation on a cold day. But as she looked at him one last time, he saw something in her eyes that wasn't there before, a release. Not forgiveness, but an acknowledgement that the debt had, in its own brutal way, been paid. "Goodbye, Artie," she said, using the name for the last time. It wasn't a term of endearment, but a final farewell to the boy he used to be. She turned and walked away, her back straight, moving toward her own future, leaving him alone with the ghosts of theirs. Arthur remained by the water's edge as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows that looked like the bars of a cage. He had lost everything, his title, his reputation, his future. But in losing it all, he had finally shed the armor he'd worn for a lifetime. He was no longer Judge Hayes, a symbol of infallible justice. He was just Arthur, a man marked by his past, finally free from the burden of pretending it didn't exist. The path forward was uncertain, shrouded in fog, but for the first time since he was a child, it was his own. And it was